Howdy.
Howdy.
Good evening. I'm Lori Taylor. I'm the head of the Department of Public Service and Administration here at the Bush School, and am very pleased to welcome you to this evening's Education Policy Workshop. Tonight, this is our 8th annual Education Policy Workshop, which is sponsored by the Bush School's Mosbacher Institute. Tonight's program, Under Pressure, Revealed Preferences and Spending Patterns in Response to the Pandemic, will be presented by my co-author and co-conspirator, Matthew Springer. Dr. Springer is a co-founder and managing partner at Basis Policy Research, with over 2 decades of experience running large-scale research, evaluation, and technical assistance projects in the education sector. Dr. Springer has been at the forefront of educational innovations and policy developments to improve the educator workforce and student educational opportunities. His work developing and leading university-based research policy practice partnerships in North Carolina and Tennessee has been instrumental in driving positive change in P16 education. Dr. Springer regularly provides consultation to public leaders, government agencies, international organizations, including entities such as the U.S. Department of Education, the U.S. Government Accountability Office, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD. His work is also widely recognized with regular publications in education and policy journals, and featured in news outlets such as ABC World News Tonight, Lou Dobbs Tonight, National Public Radio, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and the Wall Street Journal. Before joining Basis again in 2024, Dr. Springer held the prestigious Robbena and Walter E. Hussman Jr. Distinguished Professorship at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and served as a public policy and education professor at Vanderbilt University. Dr. Springer's journey into educational policy began at Denison University, where he pursued a master's in psychology and education. And early in his career, Dr. Springer served as a high school administrator and teacher in upstate New York, teaching psychology, sociology, environmental ethics, and he led an environmentally focused service learning program. He completed his PhD in education finance and policy from Vanderbilt in 2006. In addition to his role at Basis, Dr. Springer serves on the Society for Research and Educational Effectiveness Board of Directors and on the editorial boards of the American Educational Research Journal and Education Researcher. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Matthew Springer to the stage. Made it all up.
Yep. It's good. When somebody's known you this long, you're never sure what they're going to say about you, and so I was quite nervous thinking about what Lori was going to tell. I'm excited to be here. This is work in progress. It's actually 3 papers that we're working on that all combine together under a single project. So my confession is that this is the first time I've talked about all 3 papers. So it may end up being a good story or it may end up failing, but we're going to give it a try. I also want to thank Texas for loving all things big. So I rented a car in Houston, and I requested the economy size, like the little vroom vroom that you get from Avis. And on the flight here, I was filling out the forms so that your keys are waiting for you right when you pull in. And so I walked down to Avis. I'm excited. I can get my keys quickly, and they hand it to me. And they're like, "Your pickup truck's waiting for you, sir." I'm like, "All right, if they call this economy in Texas, I'll take it." That's a true story, too. I can't say all my stories are going to be true. This project is part of a much larger team of folks. So Ethan Hutt, Thad Domina, who are both professors at UNC School of Education. We've been working on this project for a number of years now. Nell Williams is a postdoc that we have at UNC. Chris Brooks, Peyton Powers, Cole Smith are PhD students. Chris actually just finished up his dissertation last week and is joining the finance group at AIR, so I'm really excited for him as well. And then we had a whole cohort of undergraduate coders who will go through, and I'll describe some of the work that they did, but went through all of the ESSER applications within North Carolina and coding up the themes and the data and some of the information that we have as well. The project is part of a joint partnership between the North Carolina Collaboratory as well as the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. The Collaboratory is a real neat group in the sense that they are a research funding arm of the General Assembly, and they support research done by researchers at institutions of higher education within the state of North Carolina. And so it ranges from things from environmental policy to education policy. Is part of looking at pandemic-related learning losses and disruptions to learning. They funded, I think, roughly about $7.2 million in research project support. I think it's 20 individual research projects at 14 of the different institutions of higher education within the state. The other part is we are a very dynamic team. We like graphs and figures. In here, this is us in action. We like to think of ourselves as, kind of going at data in all ways possible. The other reason I show this is I want to pick on Thad, is that he's wearing readers in front of what is about the size of a movie screen. And so I warned him that I was going to share this. The other warning that I have, and this is my apology to my high school English teachers, I'm going to give you the key takeaways now. And this is what I call my cliff notes. So the real setup here is ESSER provides this incredibly unique opportunity to study districts and how they responded to the pandemic and the ways in which they decided to focus their funds. We see that they're very responsive to changes over time from ESSER 1 to 2 and 3. There is quite a bit of variation in terms of how districts have proposed to spend these resources. The spending emphasis is largely on academic recovery, as well as facilities and operations, and we'll go deeper from a national scale, at least, into the facilities and operations component. Large portions of funds are spent on personnel and compensation, with an emphasis on academics. This is all what we expect, but we're seeing it play out within the budgets themselves. And it really leads to this ultimate question, which becomes, how do districts approach the fiscal cliff? I think which most of we have heard about, and what is ultimately going to be that impact on educational opportunity. And we look at this within the state of North Carolina. So the 4 parts in which I'm going to tackle this is framing the pandemic, and some qualitative work we've done. The next piece is asserting preferences. Oh, and I have to give credit to Chris Brooks, invented asserting preferences. We're really good with catchy titles here. And then Peyton Powers did staffing stressor. The asserting preferences piece is a national look at ESSER spending patterns, or proposed spending patterns, I should say, whereas staffing stressor is going to get within the state of North Carolina. So first here, just to get us going real quickly, I'm going to set the national context of what was happening in the pandemic to remind us kind of what we were wrestling with as a global society. Here's a picture from Sao Paulo, Brazil's Cope Building, which is one of kind of the cultural centers within Sao Paulo. Roughly 2,000 residents live here, and this was an image taken just before a protest of the residents banging pots and pans in response to their objection to how the government was handling the pandemic. Here's a picture that some folks may remember. This is Life Care Center in Washington State. This was the first known nursing care center that had a COVID outbreak within it. And as you see in this picture, it's family members visiting a loved one who they're unsure will make it through the COVID pandemic. Folks may remember we had drive-by birthday parties. And so people who had kids and wanted to create some sort of normalcy would do drive-by celebrations of children's birthdays as we were in lockdown. Here, this is when we were kind of in that ESSER 2 to 3 phase. This is when we got back to normal, right? When classes started to take place in person again, yet we had social distancing of 6 feet, and schools really began rethinking how we organize ourselves. Here's another photo, which is kind of showing a lot of the inequality that was taking place throughout the pandemic. Here, a group of kids are thinking pretty creatively about how to create masks. Is at the time, folks were seeing that masks would be more effective in response to protecting them from COVID. Another picture, last one here, is from Michigan. This was England, excuse me, in a photo in response to the news that there may be a lockdown, right? These are grocery store shelves that have just been absolutely cleared out. Now, within the context of Texas, I did this at the end of last week, because I just went to the CDC, so all credits to them with data. And on the left-hand side y-axis, you're seeing the weekly COVID new hospital admissions within the state of Texas. On the right-hand y-axis, you're seeing the weekly percentage of emergency department visits who are diagnosed with COVID, and along the x-axis there is by week, starting from January 11th, 2020, up until about 2 weeks ago, being March 23. Also on the bottom there, just to situate the timing of the 3 waves of ESSER, is I position them roughly around the dates of when funding became available for that component of ESSER, as well as when the funding had ended. Folks are likely to remember within Texas that there was a statewide temporary school closures that was instituted March 19th. It was temporary and supposed to go to I think the first or second week of April, and was obviously extended out until the beginning of the next academic year. The state instituted a mask mandate on July 2nd. Schools reopened in September of 2020. Businesses became fully open without restrictions on the number of individuals within stores on March 21st. Here I actually do have an apology as well to Texas. You could not see the shape of Texas when I cut and pasted this figure. So this is me using a drawing tool and trying to get the shape of Texas. So I apologize if it's way off. But this again shows you when we get to that August 2021 time frame when things are starting to go again, there's still a large number of closures over that next year as it relates to COVID-related closures within schools. I believe it was starting in the fall of 2021, Texas was one of 10 states that had the most students back in person. By January of 2022, it was one of 6 states that was back at full, had the highest percentage of students back in person. And then by the end of that academic year, I believe it was only 10 states that had the lowest rating in terms of students back in person. So there's early in some of our work as we were talking with state leaders about the different waves of ESSER and talking about access to different information that we would like for the project. It was really interesting that they described the 3 waves of ESSER in terms of triage, transitions, and transformation, which is used in different literature to describe different waves. But within the context of ESSER, what we're talking about is within the triage component, it was really preventing preventing COVID-19 and the pandemic-related transmissions. When we got in, that was $13.23 billion that was allocated at that point in time. In terms of the transition period, this was making sure that we could come back to school safely. And here, ESSER 2 was approved December 2020. Funds were available June 21, ended September 23, although there was some extensions to that, and that was $54.31 billion. Most of my talk is going to focus on ESSER 3 here. Here we're talking about $121.97 billion being allocated to schools within the United States, and it was largely built around this notion of transformation. And there wasn't defined guidelines about how school districts had to spend these funds. They said that the federal government said that 90% of funds that were allocated to states had to go to districts. And there was very few stipulations, which I'll show in just a second here. And in fact, it was the only true stipulation was that 20% of all ESSER 3 funds had to be going to something that addressed learning loss as defined by research. And again, the definition of how we might define research within this context is quite broad. Real quickly, here's a letter from April 23, 2020, from the Secretary of Education. And clearly states right in the first sentence, I'm not going to micromanage how you spend these funds. This is an opportunity to rethink how you're looking at education. You can rethink and spend dollars on infrastructure, professional development and training and technology. And we really want to just make sure that students aren't falling behind. So the first way in which we tackle this, and this is within the context of sense-making theory, we developed a taxonomy of the different ways in which districts in North Carolina from ESSER 1 through ESSER 3 proposed and described and talked about their responses to the pandemic. We used deductive and inductive approaches, easy way of saying that. One, we went through some sample applications and got a read for the ways in which they were describing the problems and their approach to addressing the problem, and then also it was based upon our experience in the literature in which we went, that we had known prior to the project taking place. In total, there's 114 districts that had consistent ESSER 1, 2, and 3 applications that were sent to the state, as well as 90 charter districts. Some of those can be a single charter or through a charter authorizer. We approach this in 2 ways. I'll just call them the human coding approach, and then we have this machine learning approach. So the human coding approach goes to the 8 trained undergraduate research assistants who were overseen by our postdoc and Ethan Hutt, who was leading this strand of the work. And they coded all of the ESSER applications according to the taxonomy that I had just referenced. 25% of all applications were double coded, and there was even things that they could add additional detail. So for example, if it was indicated that a district was going to spend on professional development, for example, coders were requested to specify for whom. The next approach, once we went through that, is we also took a structural topic modeling approach, which is an unsupervised version of machine learning. It's really developed for social science research. And essentially what we're doing here in very broad terms is it reads in every single proposal that districts had submitted. It then identifies topics through it reading the different submissions and then combines those into broader themes. You have then various tests that you can do to round down to the number of themes that you think is appropriate that you want to look at, and then you can aggregate those themes together, look at them individually. We ultimately identified 17 themes. A few of them were seen as kind of throwaway. They didn't have kind of this logical component to them, but ultimately the frames and the way in which we see them addressing the pandemic. This is the taxonomy itself. This is how they coded. This gives you some examples. That they're coding personnel, and it's talking about PD and training, sanitation staff all over the place, including things like academics, technology, health and safety, mental health, and vendors. We then see these 4 strands, right, and this comes through the structural topic modeling of beginning to conceptualize the problem frame within public health, learning loss, well-being, and then what we're calling human capital. And this is kind of a rough breakdown with some of those examples as well. Next, what I want to show, and why this kind of begins teeing up the other projects, is this is ESSER 1 here. Each it looks like a blob, but each line is the mean prevalence of a particular topics, the academics, well-being, access to instruction, and public health for an individual district. So you have those 104 running across the x-axis there. You have the 114 districts and the 90 charters. And this is what it looked like for ESSER 1, and it's not surprising that there's a huge emphasis on well-being, some access to instruction, a big emphasis on public health, and of course there is an academic component. When we get to ESSER 2 and we begin looking at this, then you see academics really overwhelmingly take over what is written within these proposals themselves. Public health drops down. We see still access to instruction to an extent, not very much, and well-being still being a focus. By the time you get to ESSER 3, again, you see slightly a shift left there. There's still considerations around public health, but again, that emphasis on academics and well-being and access to instruction is quite great. So this really sets up, and Thad Domina has been leading this strand of work as part of our larger team. So what I want to dive now into is the Asserting Preferences paper. This is where we're talking about school district spending plans. This is proposed funding and the categories in which they're looking at that individual work. And here we situate the work within the notion of isomorphism. So we're really seeing, and again, this is another sociological concept, and we're seeing that what it says basically is organizations will, either through imitation or through coercion or through kind of some type of established norms, is that they'll come together and develop and implement kind of plans that are very similar. And so we're thinking that it's likely in response to the pandemic, given that there are some guidelines, but not a huge number, that some of the spending plans would probably look pretty similar. There wouldn't be a huge amount of diversion. But at the same time, then it's brought up this notion of, well, you could take a short-term or a long-term approach to how you want to spend the dollars, right? Given the ambiguity and given the approaches that we're talking about. In short-term, we're saying, okay, they want to address the learning loss, right, which has been quantified in a number of studies. Half a grade equivalent in math, 20% in reading loss. Learning loss estimates have shown to be around $2 trillion in lifetime earnings, so quite huge. But they're also could be thinking about long-term investments in facilities. And here is just a cite to a somewhat recent GAO report that is saying roughly 54 districts need updates to major systems in greater than 50% of schools within the country. Again, descriptive, straight-up question, how do schools propose to use their ESSER funding? How do they propose to, and does it vary by school characteristics, community, COVID characteristics, and so forth? This study from a national scale really came out from reading a news article that cited this group called Burbio. How many people know Burbio? Heard of Burbio? Okay. So we hadn't heard of Burbio either. Burbio was a firm that was developed to start coding the budget data that was approved as part of ESSER 1, 2, and 3. They had largely developed it to provide it to vendors so that vendors could then provide supports where districts were hoping to receive support. They then have since developed it, and researchers began to learn about this data, request it, and they dove much deeper into the finance side. They had a school tracker as well. We were able to strike a deal with them that they gave us ESSER 3 applications for more than 5,000 districts across the U.S. I think it was 45 states. Ultimately, our analytic sample here is reduced to just under 3,000, and these were districts and budgets that were coded where we didn't see data anomalies, right? So some districts didn't report all of the information that was required, or it wasn't clear entirely what information was being provided. So we really restricted the sample down to complete information, or as complete as possible. Burbio had its own taxonomy, which we adopt for this particular study, given various constraints within the data. And it looks in many ways very, very similar to the taxonomy that I had showed you earlier for our own ESSER work as well, and it provides you examples. And where I'm going to focus our attention going forward is under this idea of facilities and operations. So what I share next then, so here's a box and whiskers plot. If in it the light gray dots is if an individual district had spent money on facilities and operations, at least $1, we show the total the proportion of dollars that were proposed for facilities and operations as a proportion of total district ESSER funding. It's a median value that within the close to center most of the time of the blue box, and then you have the first quartile and the third quartile on the ends of the blue box, and then the thin black line provides the range as well. What we're seeing here, and we also report the it's probably really small to see, and sorry I turn away from the microphone. It's a bit hard to see, but you see the percentage of districts that are proposing to spend at least something underneath the name of a particular category. Clearly you're seeing here variation across districts. You'll remember the point that 20% of the main stipulation was at least 20% of funding had to be allocated to academic learning loss. And that's really why you're seeing that hard cutoff in facilities and operations occurring right at 80% there. Although there are a few districts that go beyond that and can establish a rationale of why that took place. So 80% of districts allocated to facilities and operations, staffing, academic interventions, which we see here. In the accounting for the highest proportion, there are clearly different approaches, but what I want us to focus in here is I show for the first tertile of facility and operation spending, and for the third tertile of facilities and operation spending, we see 2% being proposed on facilities and operation spending in the first tertile. Yet in that third tertile, we're seeing close to 60%. Now, if we look under that, the next highest categories that we see, academic interventions, professional development, staffing, you see then very different spending within those categories, right? And so we're seeing this variation within the spending data as well. We run next step was we run some basic regressions, controlling for a variety of school characteristics, community characteristics, COVID characteristics, state fixed effects, to begin looking at, is there a relationship between some of these observables and whether they propose to spend on a particular, or how much they propose to spend on a particular category. And we see this really strong relationship between poverty rate and proposed spending on facilities and operations, and ultimately comes down to, if we kind of put more of a substantive interpretation on a 1 standard deviation increase in poverty rates associated with a 6.53 percentage point increase, which is actually quite large given the base. So it's actually going from 27.3 of total funding up to 33.83% of funding. So we're seeing a big allocation based upon increases in poverty rate, and we can put forward in just a minute here different ways we can think of this. Now, the astute listener, everyone is still awake in here, which is phenomenal. I'm doing better than I did when I taught. is obviously you can spend on facilities and operations in a number of different ways. And so we have these, in the data, we're able to find these micro categories, right? And we can tell whether school districts are proposing to spend money on things like heating and cooling, HVACs, new construction. And so what we wanted to do is begin thinking about, well, is we have these different ways that districts are spending, right? Or percentage of districts that propose to spend, and their percentage of total overall ESSER spending. Are we seeing differences by higher cost items and more long-term items than we are seeing in stuff that can be corrected either for personal protective equipment, which is something you could probably purchase off of Amazon, replacement of water fountains with the bottle refill stations and things along those lines. Again, so what we do here, perfect. Oh, here we go. Great. And so what we do here is we code those micro categories into major construction, classroom and school infrastructure, and supplies and protective equipment. And we're essentially arguing here that top category is the more expensive ones, whereas it would be less costly on the bottom ones. We run a series of linear probability models, simply predicting the likelihood that a district would spend on that and how it then connects with district poverty rate. Same covariates in the prior model. And here's the subcategories that make this up. So we individually coded these, compared notes, and talked to other people about them. Now there are clearly some limitations, like filters is baked in with HVAC, but we still consider that a major construction. I think in terms of overall costs, filters is not going to be very expensive, but some of these larger things will be. And here you see just from a variety of these models what that relationships looks like. And you see as you have a 1 unit increase in district poverty rate, right? You're seeing the likelihood of spending on these particular major construction categories going up quite a bit. You see a little with outdoor equipment as well, but for the most part under these shorter term type of spending items, not seeing as much of a relationship there. And so as we went back, and I mentioned this notion of isomorphism, we think it's really going against that idea that everyone would be spending dollars in the same way. And there may be equity considerations here, right? And maybe we can have a discussion at the end of this about whether that's true or not. But districts that are proposing to spend dollars on major construction, that benefits students in the long run, right? It's going to be a year, 2, 3 years before some of these major construction projects are over, and then students will realize the benefit from that. And yes, there's literature that's saying that students benefit from new construction and from these facility upgrades, particularly students in larger districts and from districts with a higher percentage of students qualifying for free and reduced price lunch, so a literature base supporting it. But again, it's not addressing that immediate need. Where we see these academic interventions, right, is addressing the short-term impact as well. There's another interpretation here though too, which is, okay, well, there's this thing called the fiscal cliff that everyone's talking about. And there's going to be potentially major disruptions to staffing depending upon how districts propose to use their ESSER III dollars. If they allocated a lot of those dollars to staffing, which we saw about 82% of districts in the national sample, right, there may be big disruptions from that immediate focus on academic interventions when those staff, assuming they were focused on academics, right, the funding runs out to support them, right? And so maybe there's that trade-off there as well. So to dive into this now, we went from the national level. We're going to go back into North Carolina here. Again, our whole team's working on this. Peyton and Chris have been grinding away on this for the past couple weeks. And the motivation here, right, at this point has largely been based in the media, right? And so Ed Week, school districts prepare for major cuts. Teacher layoffs are mounting. How can districts soften the blow? Even your very own, oh, no, not there yet. Here's a Texas-specific one. So in Fort Worth, eliminating 133 jobs, 129 of those jobs were supported by pandemic funding. The 74, right? Schools could lose nationally close to 136,000 jobs when ESSER III funding ends. Right? And so that was set at September 2024. Now those funds have to be obligated by September 2024 and then spent by the end of December. That has since been extended where you can have special accommodations to go out 2026. But in some of our, at least within North Carolina, we're seeing quite a bit of the spending actually take place in real time. Now, though, the 74 also says that there's some early evidence suggesting that North Carolina districts played it safe on things like teacher pay, and they may avoid the fiscal cliff, right? And so we're digging into that. And then your very own Lori Taylor here, right, from the Chalk Beat. Districts are being weaned off the funding, and makes a point that I haven't stressed yet, but I want to stress, is that these are one-time funds. And in many instances now, school districts across the country are saying our budgets are being cut. Well, no, this was dollars that was provided knowing that when they received that funding was going to end. Yet we see this tension building as those additional resources have been seen as a typical part of our operations, and I think in many practice locations they're seeing this as cuts as well. So, simple research questions again. How did school districts propose to use ESSER funding? How does proposed spending? Now we're going to be able to compare it to actual spending. And how much did school districts allocate to personnel and compensation? And that begins to get us at this notion of the fiscal cliff. I wish we were a year ahead right now, and we had data on the teacher labor market, and we had student achievement data, and we can making some of these next steps, but this is begin setting up those sets of analyses. In terms of data sources, we were given access to every single proposed budget spending plan for ESSER 1, 2, and 3. Here we're just focused on 3 that districts submitted to the state, as well as any revisions that districts submitted to the state, as well as what we're calling the actual budgets, which are those that were submitted as final for that particular fiscal year at the end of June. Some districts had revised throughout the course of a year their budgets more than 10 times and had submitted it to the state as well. Other districts never revised their budgets as well. The piece here where I think we begin to push a little bit forward of where previous studies have lied is that we actually turn to the Federal Chart of Accounts, which provides particular purpose and object codes. We're able then to take these federal codes, merge them onto the North Carolina data, and have a better understanding of what the true purpose of the spending of the proposed line items were for, and then the actual object in which it was set to purchase, and then that's how we begin diving into this. And that shows it here, usual suspects being district classifications. Purpose codes, just for those who are unfamiliar potentially with federal budgets, that's just describing the purpose of the funding or the function, where the object is classifying items or services. Now, within this, I don't think, I do have it on here. So within purpose codes, in the proposed budget, there's 57 unique purpose codes that were used by districts, 110 unique object codes. There are roughly about 812 unique purpose object code combinations in proposed budgets, and roughly around 1,030 unique purpose object code combinations that were used in actual spending after the first year. From this, we went through a couple independent coders who went through and began to map on the purpose codes back onto some of the major constructs that we were talking about in ways in which districts are conceptualizing it. So academics, vendors and partnerships, operations and management, well-being, technology, and there's this undecided category as well, which actually had quite a bit of funding too. In both proposed and actual spending. In terms of the breakdown, this is a donut graph. Everybody these days they say never use a pie chart, right? And so this is my solution. I'm going to use a donut chart instead. All that is simply inserting a white circle in the center of my pie chart there, and putting the word proposed. So we're seeing again roughly about 50% of all dollars were proposed to be spent on academic components. 16% vendors and partnerships, and you can go all the way around as well. And so unlike, and I'll go here, and here same box and whiskers plot as you saw for the nationally, unlike the national data we had, and North Carolina was not in that sample due to data limitations within the Burbio data, we're seeing in the actual budgets that were submitted to the state, very different pattern, right? We're seeing a huge emphasis here on academic categories. Over 60%, as well. Operations management, technology are kind of not close behind, but they're the next categories as well. So here again we have the proposed breakdown according to those categories that I had just described to you. And this was hot off the presses as of last night. And it's quite interesting. It's very similar. I thought they would be quite different, in fact. And so we actually see a tiny uptick in academics, largely from a decrease in the undecided categories. Just so you have a little bit, these are the top 10 purpose codes. This accounts for roughly 26-27% of total ESSER 3 proposed spending within the state of North Carolina. And you see things like regular curricular services, remedial supplement K-12 services, and then you see it compared to the top 10 actual, and they're very similar. So instructional technology drops out from the proposed top 10 when you get to the actual top 10, and it's replaced by maintenance services, but very consistent between the proposed and actual spending. If I showed the object codes as well, it's the exact same thing. I wasn't sure how many simple tables folks wanted to see here. There's that. Oh, so here's the object purpose code combinations, which give you an idea. And I just highlight these under actual because what you're seeing is you're seeing academic spending and academic spending on personnel, right? So regular curricular services, we can see that it was for Social Security costs. Regular curricular services, we can see it was for retirement, right? And so we're seeing the full picture, as well as then regular curricular services attached to a teacher. So there's two ways that we're getting at this notion of personnel, in fact, within these budgets that was not available in the prior information that folks were studying. So we can see a personnel move both through something like regular curricular services with the object of personnel, but we also can see it through a combination that would say regular curricular services and single salary schedule, right? And just saying that hire was placed on the traditional salary schedule as well. What this breakdown looks like in general, in terms of proposed spending within ESSER North Carolina, is we see just under $500 million going to personnel, and then over $2 billion going to non-personnel. But as I just highlighted there, there's this other way in which spending on personnel can be hidden within the compensation category, and that's accounting actually for another just over $500 million. And so what we're talking about within the state of North Carolina, at least, assuming the proposed and actual spending align, is looking at the end of ESSER 3 funding when it runs out, about $100 billion that was spent on personnel. So then the next logical question is, okay, well, maybe they're just temporary personnel. Maybe it was on services that are no longer needed when ESSER runs out. And so we go the backwards way now and we say, okay, well, let's just take the personnel plus compensation costs and look at how that's coded across the same taxonomy that I shared with you. And what we're seeing is almost 80% of all of those dollars, right, of there's over that $1 billion was for academic purposes. And so this is why I alluded to when we're seeing that long-term component with facilities and operations is one explanation, and maybe not the best approach to address the immediate needs of students. Well, if you address the immediate needs of students through personnel, right, and that runs out, there's going to be a huge change in the number of personnel that we're addressing academics for the past 2 years within these schooling systems, that now the funding ends unless additional sources begin to bring it up. We will hopefully be getting the personnel. We'll begin working with the actual employee compensation file, so then we can begin thinking about the mapping and looking at who's a new employee, who's been around. If some of this compensation is simply bonus pay, right? Because that could be a significant part of it. We have looked at the breakdown within the compensation component itself. Roughly 30% of that spending is on the single salary schedule. Roughly, I think it was right around 30% as well, was on differentiated compensation components. 20% was benefits, and then the remainder, a smaller piece, was on other types of pay as well. So that might be a hint that at least 30% of those dollars are going to personnel who they thought would be around full time. Equity component here as we end. Oh, and I highlight here, is there an opportunity though, right? Nobody wants to face layoffs, but we have faced a similar situation with the Great Recession. So thinking 2007 to 2009, and we have lessons we can learn from that potentially. And there may be an opportunity, particularly as we think about the educational opportunity that's being provided to children within the schools, and that is, how do we approach the layoffs? You can't avoid it, right? don't want to have to go down that path, but there may be ways to think about strategic staffing decisions where principals and school leaders develop a comprehensive approach to evaluating the composition of their staff and thinking about the staff that they retain. Most districts in the past have used what's called first in, first out, or last in, first out policies. So the last individuals who were hired were the first out, LIFO, right? It's a very traditional approach. It's often part of collective bargaining agreements. And research from the Great Recession, though, has shown that the quality of the workforce under a LIFO policy versus a policy that has a performance-based component is very different, right? And the quality of that workforce, according to certain metrics that we can calculate within this administrative data, right, is higher under a performance-based approach, or at least an approach that takes that into consideration. There's an equity implication here as well, is that schools in traditionally underserved districts or underserved areas, or students from underserved backgrounds, oftentimes have teachers that have the fewest years of experience. We also know that teacher churn can have a negative impact on students, right? And so you're going to have the largest, under a LIFO policy, you're going to have the largest churn in those areas as well. Sometimes they approach it at the school level and just say, okay, we're going to take, just look at across the board at the school level. And so those big cuts are coming in these traditionally underserved types of settings as well. And I think it's important to avoid. So I'm hoping that, states begin discussing this particular component, right? There is this opportunity to fundamentally change the workforce if we take an approach that not only puts the teacher in the center, but really focuses on the student as well. And hopefully, some data will allow us to dig into that, and as we learn more, as districts are beginning to develop it. I think I was under 50 minutes there, hopefully. And here we go. So ESSER these are just the key takeaways again. Not going to run through them, but really that big piece at the end is how districts are approaching fiscal cliff and the substantial impact it can have on educational opportunity. Thank you very much. You want me down?
No, I want you right here.
Okay, perfect.
So now we're going to take advantage of the opportunity that you can't leave the state.
Okay.
And we're going to offer the audience an opportunity to ask you some questions. We have microphones that the Bush School ambassadors are holding. Please do use a microphone to ask a question, because we want to be able to make sure that we're recording this so other people can hear what's going on. But I'm going to take chair's prerogative and ask the first really sticky question. Okay? So take advantage of the fact that you no longer work for the state of North Carolina.
Yes.
Did the districts in North Carolina spend their ESSER funds wisely?
I'm going to say that I said this earlier today too. The three hardest words for an academic, or at least a recovering academic, to say, I don't know. And I think there's clearly thoughtful, and this is from some of the qualitative stuff. This is from reading the applications themselves. I mean, a tremendous amount of thought went into the ways in which the districts had approached the funding, right? And there's plans where they had teacher groups coming together. They had people from the community coming together. There's a data-driven component that's justifying the certain decisions they make. So yes, a lot of went into it. But in terms of the wisely piece, my head goes, okay, how does it relate to learning loss, right? Which we've seen, but also how does it relate then to this opportunity component? So it's yet to be known, I think.
How will we know? When will we know?
How will we know? When will we know? We will have a first set of outcome data in the fall, and dive into that super quickly. As many people are working in this area and are interested in that, I hope we have better classifications of ways which we're looking at this data, because I think it's pretty rich when we get those federal purpose and object codes into it. And so hopefully we might be able to find ways that, ideally, the hope is you'll be able to see ways in which districts spent their dollars, understand the purposes in which they're going to it, and seeing a relationship with student outcomes, right? Or potentially student teacher retention, right? There's a lot went into bonus dollars. Now, as Lori and I both know, as we've done a lot of this within Texas, it really depends how you spend those dollars. And in the past, kind of locally defined performance pay systems have not been aligned with what I would say is best practice in designing these compensation systems.
Any questions from the crowd?
Really excellent talk. Thank you very much. This is really great that you're back in Texas. One question I had was, a lot of times I think districts or just anyone getting government assistance in general might be tempted to use this money to solve previous problems. Do you know what I'm saying? So to
Yeah.
what extent does the variation across districts in their either planned or actual spending relate to prior problems they might have had, like for staff turnover or capital constraints? Like in the poorer districts, you mentioned that more of the poorer districts might be invested more in capital or facilities and that sort of thing when they couldn't get the money before versus the crisis itself.
Yes, and so this is a great fantastic question, but also a really important investigation is kind of diving into seeing what was happening in the past. And in some of the really basic regressions I show, we do control for 3 years of prior capital spending, so we're kind of taking into account some of what they've done in the past. But we do know, actually, because there wasn't the supplant and supplement provision that we typically see in Title I, and so some districts did use the ESSER $3 to pay for current teachers and employees so that they could free up local dollars for other purposes. And my hunch is those other purposes are likely addressing some of these these other needs that may be going on, and some of that's going to be Thad and Ethan are about to launch out with a bunch of interviews from across the state, and hopefully we're going to see some more of that in practice as well. Well, not see it, but understand it better in practice.
So could you talk a bit more about the equity implications of the fact that the more high poverty schools went for longer term kind of payoff things, essentially acting as if they understood that this was one-time money, whereas the more affluent schools kind of put the money into learning loss interventions, but things that were short-term and things that lead to a fiscal cliff?
Yes, so absolutely. This is like where my first concern, where I first focused when I saw the evidence, right, between more affluent districts spending money on that short-term learning loss idea, where we see the capital investments in districts with higher proportions of students from free and reduced price lunch backgrounds, right, because of the impact. And there's going to be that cohort, right, that may be even more underserved than they would have been otherwise as a result of the pandemic. Now, we can think of that in a different way, though. I mean, in that the disruption, the churn that we're going to see because of the personnel that were hired in support of those academic pursuits might actually offset or even be worse than that recovery that took place. Do I know if that's going to take place? Not sure. We do know churn is, has pretty big negative consequences in the schools in which it takes place, and so it's an empirical question that we're going to be able to get at. But my prior coming into this is that if we're truly focused on just solving the short-term learning loss, the emphasis would be purely the academic side and less on the facilities and operations side, giving the time that, and I'm saying long-term facilities and operations like the new construction components and so forth. The other good piece here too is that Lori left her wallet up here, so afterwards drinks are on me.
Actually, drinks are on me, and they'll be outside.
Perfect, perfect.
15 minutes, so you got a song and dance time.
I could do song and dance. I'm just excited that I get a great treat. We can all go to dinner too.
So yeah, I'm still trying to get the heterogeneity across these districts, but also when Lori was asking, were these monies spent wisely? And I'm new to education economics. Yes, I'm sorry about that. But like, what do we know about how the monies in these different categories when they're spent, that they affect different educational outcomes, right? And how does that correspond with losses that were expected now from your position ex post knowing what we know about what actually happened in the pandemic. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. So I think that the debate within ed finance circles was always, does money matter? I think today most people say money matters, but exactly how that spending is taking place, we're learning more about those individual categories. And so even the recent bond referendum study that came out was one of the first to clearly show that the kind of capital spending, the new facilities, and being able to look very closely at like new facilities such as a sports stadium did not have an impact on students. New facilities such as a new academic center on campus had a positive impact, and that positive impact was actually particularly helpful for students from traditionally underserved backgrounds, right? And so we're at that level. The hope is the next some of the contribution here is getting to a finer grain to see certain programs and policies. Now they say that things had to be research based, right? So we're talking about tutoring, and even from work with colleagues who colleagues in the room are leading right now, is that tutoring can be highly effective, right? Like high dosage tutoring, high quality tutoring. It's expensive, but it can be really effective. And we know districts did that. Is it high quality tutoring? I'm not sure, but again, there's another path to go around. As well. And I'm not trying to dodge the question, but I think empirically we don't know enough yet at that fine grain level to say this is how we can best spend these dollars. I think we have a lot of people using a massive amount of funds in different ways. We're going to see a lot of, unfortunately, I'm sure we're going to see a lot of waste or just inefficient use of those resources. And hopefully in other places we're able to see really a meaningful relationship as well. And many of these analyses are preliminary, so if you see a paper in 6 months and some figure's different, you can't hold me to it. I need to put that disclaimer in now.
Well, what if I want to hold you to it?
Yeah, I know. There we go.
Fantastic.
Can I buy you dinner?
Fantastic talk. I'm kind of interested in the interplay of how some of these district spending habits, especially with ESSER 2 and I suppose to a lesser extent ESSER 3, interacted with the reopening decisions that their states made. When y'all were pouring through all this data, did y'all notice any differences in how schools requested and used ESSER money in states that reopened fully pretty early like Texas, or somebody like, a California, where reopening was much later?
Yep. I haven't looked at that personally. I don't know. Chris did much more with the national data, so I wish he was here and I could say, hey, Chris, what's the answer? He may have it, but we did not go down that particular path. And reopening was kind of universal within North Carolina, where we have that finer grained information. But some of the school, and again, this is a component of Burbio, but they were tracking that on a national level, so I think it is definitely an answerable question. And the other piece to the prior question as well is how are districts spending the ESSER $3, even though it is more prescriptive, ESSER $2, even though it was more prescriptive than the ESSER $3, you could be satisfying other needs with those ESSER $2 that then make your spending different with ESSER 3, which could then be that trade-off between academic and facilities, for example.
Will everybody please join me in thanking Dr. Springer?